Hi, happy Tuesday, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Story Time. And we are picking up. We finally made it to volume 3 of 4, so that's really exciting. Here in War and Peace, while we're being playing as a team here and limiting our outside interaction because of COVID-19. So we are using our time for great stuff, like to read one of the longest novels in the Western world. As you may recall, let's see, it had a lovely ending. And it was with Pierre consoling and expressing his affection for Natasha Rostov, who is now, her reputation is now basically ruined because she tried but did not run away with Anatoly Kuragin, who is in fact married and an all-around scoundrel. So it broken off her engagement with Prince Andrei and tried to run off with Anatoly. Prince Andrei is upset, but he's sort of taking it like his father would, and he's very being very dismissive about it and kind of bordering on like being really like cold and cruel about it, like as if him not having feeling, like trying to protect his feelings of being upset by pretending he doesn't have any, and that, you know, just being like very above it all. But you can tell it's, one, because he really is hurt, and two, because that's how his father deals with feelings, is that he just becomes apparently like outwardly mean to the people he cares about, or the people who are upsetting him. So unfortunately, it seems Prince Andrei is following in his father's footsteps. Pierre trying to smooth things over, and because of his affection for both Prince Andrei and for Natasha, unfortunately that didn't work, but Pierre's in the middle. And that took us to the end of volume 2. So now we're in volume 3, which is about halfway done. Very exciting. We're almost there, friends. And I just hope everyone had a great weekend. Sorry we missed reading yesterday, but had a great weekend and is still being safe and conscious and considerate of other people. It's a really difficult and stressful time right now for everyone for a lot of reasons. So just encouraging everyone to, when you want to get frustrated, do that. Even today, just take a breath. Like we're a team. We're all in this together. We're trying to survive together. So it's volume 3, part 1, section 1. We're going to read 1, 2, and 3 today. Since the end of the year 1811, an intense arming and concentration of Western European forces had begun, and in the year 1812, those forces, millions of men, including those who transported and fed the army, moved from west to east to the borders of Russia, towards which, since the year 1811, the forces of Russia had been drawn in exactly the same way. On the 12th of June, the forces of Western Europe crossed the borders of Russia and war began. That is, an event took place contrary to human reason and to the whole of human nature. Millions of people committed against each other such a countless number of villainies, deceptions, betrayals, thefts, forgeries, and distributions of false banknotes, robberies, arsons, and murders as the annals of all the law courts in the world could not assemble in whole centuries, and which at that period of time the people who committed them did not look upon as crimes. What produced this extraordinary event? What were its causes? Historians say that with naive assurance that the causes of this event were the offense inflicted upon the old Duke of Oldenburg, the non-observance of the continental system, Napoleon's love of power, Alexander's firmness, diplomatic mistakes, and so on. Consequently, it needed only the Metternich, Rumyantsev, or Talleyrand between Levy and Rout make a little better effort and write a little more skillful dispatch, or that Napoleon write to Alexander, Monsieur mon frère, je consens à rendre la douche à Duc de Oldenburg, my dear sir, my brother, I agree to give the duchy back to the old Duke of Oldenburg, and that there would have been no war. Understandably, that was how the matter presented itself to contemporaries. Understandably, it seemed to Napoleon that the war was caused by the intrigues of England, as he said, in fact, on the Isle of St. Helena. Understandably, to the members of the English Parliament, it seemed that the war was caused by Napoleon's love of power. To Prince Oldenburg, it seemed that the war was caused by violence done to him. To the merchants, it seemed that the war was caused by the continental system, which was ruining Europe. To the old soldiers in general, it seemed that the chief cause was the need to make use of them. To the legitimists of the time, that is what was necessary to restore les bons principes. And to the diplomats of that time, that it had all happened because the alliance between Russia and Austria in 1809 had not been concealed skillfully enough from Napoleon, and because the memorandum number 178 had been clumsily worded. Understandably, these and a endless number of other causes, the number of which depends on countless different points of view, presented themselves to contemporaries, but for us, the descendants who contemplate the enormity of the event in all its scope and delve into its simple and terrible meaning, these causes seem insufficient. For us, it is not understandable that millions of Christians killed and tortured each other because Napoleon was a lover of power, Alexander was firm, English policy was cunning, and the old Duke of Oldenburg offended. It is impossible to understand what connection there is between these circumstances and the fact of killing and violence. Why? Because the Duke of Oldenburg was offended, thousands of men from the other end of Europe would kill and ravage the people of Smolensk and Moscow provinces and be killed by them. For us, descendants who are not historians, who are not carried away by the process of research and therefore can contemplate events with unobscured common sense, a countless number of causes present themselves. The deeper we go into each of these causes, the more of them we find, and each cause, taken singly, or whole series of causes, present themselves to us as equally correct in themselves and equally false in their insignificance in comparison with the enormity of the event, and equally false in their incapacity, without the participation of all other coinciding causes, to produce the event that took place. The willingness or unwillingness of one French corporal to enlist for a second tour of duty appears to us a good cause as Napoleon's refusal to withdraw his army beyond the Vistula and give back the Duchy of Oldenburg. For if he had been unwilling to serve, and another had been unwilling, and a third, and 1,000 corporal and soldier, there would have been so many less men in Napoleon's army, and there could have been no war. If Napoleon had not been insulted by the demand to withdraw beyond the Vistula, and had not ordered his troops to advance, there would have been no war. But if all the sergeants had been unwilling to enlist for a second tour of duty, there could have been no war. There also could have been no war if there had been no intrigues of the English, if there had been no Prince of Oldenburg and insulted feelings in Alexander, if there had been no autocratic power in Russia, and if there had been no French Revolution and subsequent dictatorship and empire, and all that produced the French Revolution, and so on. Without any of these causes, nothing could have happened. Therefore, all these causes, billions of causes, coincided so as to bring about what happened. And consequently, none of them was the exclusive cause of the event, but the event had to take place simply because it had to take place. Millions of men, renouncing their human feelings and their reason, had to go from west to east and kill their own kind, just as, several centuries earlier, hordes of men had gone from east to west, killing their own kind. The actions of Napoleon and Alexander, on whose word it seems to have depended whether the event took place or not, were as little willed as the action of each soldier who went into the campaign by little or by lot or by conscription. This could not be otherwise, because for the will of Napoleon and Alexander, the men on whom the event seemed to depend, to be fulfilled, the coincidence of countless circumstances was necessary, without any one of which the event could not have taken place. It was necessary that millions of men, in whose hands the actual power lay, the soldiers who shot, transported provisions and cannon, it was necessary that they agreed to fulfill this will of isolated and weak men, and be brought to that by a countless number of complex and diverse causes. Fatalism in history is inevitable for the explanation of senseless phenomena. That is, those whose sense we do not understand. Whose sense we do not understand. The more we try to explain sensibly these phenomena of history, the more senseless and incomprehensible they become for us. Each man lives for himself, uses his freedom to achieve his personal goals, and feels with his whole being that right now he can or cannot do such and such an action. But as soon as he does it, this action, committed at a certain moment in time, becomes irreversible and makes itself the property of history, in which it has not a free but predestined significance. There are two sides to each man's life: his personal life, which is the more free, the more abstract its interests, and his elemental, swarm-like life, where man inevitably fulfills the laws prescribed to him. Man lives consciously for himself, but serves as an unconscious instrument for the achievement of historical, universally human goals. An action, once committed, is irrevocable, and its effort, coinciding in time with millions of actions of other people, acquires historical significance. The higher a man stands on the social ladder, the greater the number of people he is connected with. The more power he has over other people, the more obvious is the predestination and inevitability of his every action. The hearts of kings are in the hands of God. Kings are the slaves of history. History, that is, the unconscious swarm-like life of mankind, uses every moment of a king's life as an instrument for its purposes. Napoleon, though now in 1812 it seemed to him more than ever that it depended on him, verser or not, verser le sang de ses troupes, as Alexander wrote in his last letter to him, had never been more subject than now to those inevitable laws which forced him, acting by his own free will, as it seemed to him, with respect to himself, to do for the common cause, for history, that which had to be accomplished. Men of the West moved towards the East in order to kill each other, and by the law of coincidence of causes, thousands of minute causes of this movement and of the war fitted into and coincided with the event. Reproaches for the non-observance of the continental system, the Duke of Oldenburg and the movement of troops into Prussia, undertaken, as it seemed to Napoleon, only to achieve an armed peace, and the French emperor's love and habit of war, which coincided with his nation's disposition, the enthusiasm for grandiose preparations and the expense of the preparations, and the need to obtain advantages that would recover the expenses, and the intoxicating honors in Dresden and diplomatic negotiations which, according to the views of contemporaries, were conducted with a sincere desire to achieve peace, and which only wounded the vanity of both sides, and millions of other causes which fit into the events that was to be accomplished, coinciding with it. When an apple ripens and falls, what makes it fall? Is it that it is attracted to the ground? Is it that the stem withers? Is it that the sun has dried it up? That it has grown heavier? That the wind shakes it? That the boy standing underneath it wants to eat it? No one thing is the cause. All of this is the coincidence of conditions under which every organic event of life is accomplished. And the botanist who finds that the apple falls because the cellular tissue degenerates and so on, will be as right and as wrong as the child who stands underneath and says that the apple fell because he wanted to eat it and prayed for it. As he who says that Napoleon went to Moscow because he wanted to and perished because Alexander wanted him to perish, will be both right and wrong. So he will be right and wrong who says that an undermined hill weighing 1,000,000 pounds collapsed because the last worker struck it at the last time with his pick. In historical events, the so-called great men are labels that give the event a name, which, just as with labels, has the least connection with all with the event itself. Every action, which to them seems willed by themselves, in historical sense is not willed, but happens in connection with the whole course of history and has been destined from before all ages. On the 29th of May, Napoleon left Section 2. On the 29th of May, Napoleon left Dresden, where he had spent 3 weeks surrounded by a court composed of princes, dukes, kings, and even one emperor. Before his departure, Napoleon showed kindness to the princes, kings, and emperor who deserved it, and scolded the princes and kings with whom he was not entirely pleased, made a gift of his own, that is, taken from other kings, pearls and diamonds to the Austrian emperor, and tenderly embracing the Empress Marie-Louise, as his historian says, left her upset by this separation which she, this Marie-Louise, who was considered his wife, though another wife had been left in Paris, seemed unable to endure. Though the diplomats still firmly believed in the possibility of peace and were working hard towards that end, though the Emperor Napoleon himself wrote a letter to the Emperor Alexander calling him Monsieur mon frère and sincerely assuring him that he did not want war and would always love and respect him, he drove off to the army and gave new orders at every station, having the aim of hastening the movement of the army from west to east. He drove in a traveling coach and six, surrounded by pages, adjutants, and an escort, down the high road to Posen, Thorn, Danzig, and Königsberg. In each of these towns, thousands of people met him with trembling and ecstasy. The army moved from west to east, and 6 horse relays carried him there as well. On the 10th of June, he caught up with the army and spent the night in the Wilkowiski forest, in quarters prepared for him on the estate of a Polish count. The next day, Napoleon, going ahead of his army, drove to Niemen in his carriage and to look for a crossing place, changed into a Polish uniform, and drove out on the banks. Seeing Cossacks, les Cossacks, on the other side, and the spreading steppe, les steppes, in the middle of which lay Moscow, la ville sainte, capital of that state, similar to this Scythian state to which Alexander the Great had marched. Napoleon, unexpectedly for everyone, and contrary to both strategic and diplomatic considerations, ordered an advance, and the next day his troops started crossing the Niemen. Early in the morning of the 12th, he came out of the tent, pitched that day on the steep left bank of the Niemen, watched through a field glass the streams of his troops flowing out of the Wilkowiski forest and pouring over 3 bridges thrown across the Niemen. The troops knew of the emperor's presence, sought him with their eyes, and when they found a figure in a frock, coat, and hat, standing apart from his suite on a hill in front of the tent, they threw their hats in the air and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" And one after another inexhaustibly kept pouring from the huge forest that had concealed them till then, and dividing up, crossed over the 3 bridges to the other side. "We'll get somewhere this time. Oh, when he mixes into himself, things get hot. By God, there he is! Long live the Emperor! So there are the steppes of Asia. Vile country all the same. Goodbye, Bush. I'm reserving the best place in Moscow for you. Goodbye. Good luck. Did you see the Emperor? Long live the Emperor! Pere! If they make me governor of the Indies, Gerard, I'll make you minister of Kashmir. That's settled. Long live the Emperor! Long live, long live, long live! Those rascally Cossacks, how they scuttled off. Long live the Emperor! There he is. Do you see him? I saw him twice as I see you. And the little corporal, I saw him give the cross to one of the old men. Long live the Emperor! Said the voices of old and young, of the most diverse characters and social positions. The faces of all these men had one common expression of joy at the beginning of a long-awaited campaign, and of rapture and devotion to the man in the gray frock coat who stood on the hill. On the 13th of June, Napoleon was brought a small, purebred Arabian horse, and he mounted up and rode at a gallop to one of the bridges across the Niemen, constantly deafened by rapturous cries, which he evidently put up with only because it was impossible to forbid them to express their love for him by these cries. But these cries that accompanied him everywhere oppressed him and distracted him from the military concerns that had consumed him since the time he joined the army. He rode across one of the bridges, rocking on pontoons to the other side, turned sharply to the left, and galloped off in the direction of Kovno, preceded by the horse guard chasseurs, thrilled with happiness and raptured, who galloped ahead of him, clearing the way through the troops. Having come to the wide bank of the Viliva, he stopped beside a regiment of Polish Uhlans that stood on the bank. "Vivant!" the Poles cried just as rapturously, breaking their lines and crushing each other in order to see him. Napoleon surveyed the river, dismounted, and sat on a log that lay on the bank. At a wordless sign, he was handed a field glass and placed it on the back of a happy page, who ran over and began to look at the other side. Then he immersed himself in examining a map laid out among the logs. Without raising his head, he said something, and two of the adjutants rode over to the Polish uhlans. "What? What did he say?" came from the lines of the Polish uhlans as one adjutant rode up to them. The order was to find a ford and crossed over to the other side. The colonel of the Polish uhlans, a handsome old man, turned red and, stumbling over his words from excitement, asked the adjutant whether he would be allowed to swim across the river with his uhlans without looking for a ford. Obviously fearing a refusal, like a boy who asks permission to get on a horse, he begged to be allowed to swim across the river before the emperor's eyes. The adjutant said that the emperor would probably not be displeased by this excessive zeal. As soon as the adjutant said it, the mustached old officer, with a happy face and flashing eyes, raised his saber and shouted "Vivant!" and, commanding the uhlans to follow him, spurred his horse and rode to the river. He angrily spurred his horse, which hesitated under him, and threw himself into the water, heading for the depths where the current was swift. Hundreds of uhlans followed him. It was cold and scary in the middle and in the swift current. The uhlans grasped at each other, fell off their horses. Some horses drowned. Men drowned as well. Others tried to swim for it, some in the saddle, others holding on to their horses' manes. They tried to swim forward to the other side, and though there was a ford a quarter of a mile away, they were proud to swim and drown in this river before the eyes of the man who sat on a log and was not even looking at what they were doing. When the adjutant returned and, choosing the right moment, allowed himself to draw the emperor's attention to the devotion of the Poles to his person, the little man in the gray frock coat stood up, summoning a Berthier to him, began pacing up and down the bank with him, giving him orders and occasionally glancing with displeasure at the drowning uhlans, who distracted his attention. For him it was no new conviction that his presence at all ends of the world, from Africa to the steppes of Muscovy, struck people in the same way and threw them into the madness of self-oblivion. He ordered his horse brought to him and rode to his camp. Some 40 uhlans drowned in the river, despite the boats that were sent to help. Most of the men were washed back to this side. The colonel and several other men crossed the river and barely managed to climb out on the bank. But as soon as they climbed out, their streaming wet clothes sticking to them, they shouted "Vivant!" gazing rapturously at the spot where Napoleon had stood, but where he was no longer. And at that moment, they considered themselves happy. In the evening, between two orders, one about the speedy delivery of forged Russian banknotes prepared for distribution in Russia, and the other about shooting a Saxon caught with a letter containing information about the orders of the French army, Napoleon gave a third order about enrolling the Polish colonel, who had needlessly thrown himself into the river, in the Legion d'Honneur and the Légion d'Honneur, which Napoleon himself was the head. Qu'est-ce vous perdez de méthode? Meanwhile, the Russian emperor had already spent more than a month in Vilna, holding reviews and maneuvers. Nothing was prepared for the war which everybody expected. Sorry, this is section 3. Meanwhile, the Russian emperor had spent more than a month in Vilna preparing reviews and maneuvers. Nothing was prepared for war, which everybody expected, and for the preparation of which the emperor had come from Petersburg. There was no general plan of action. Hesitation over which plan of all those prepared was to be accepted increased still more after the emperor's 1-month stay at headquarters. Each of the 3 armies had a separate commander-in-chief, but there was no supreme commander over all the armies, and the emperor would not take the title upon himself. The longer the emperor stayed in Vilna, the less and less did they prepare for war, grown weary for expecting it. All the strivings of the people who surrounded the emperor were, it seemed, aimed only at making the sovereign, while passing the time pleasantly, forget about the impending war. In the month of June, after many balls and fetes given by the Polish dignitaries, by the courtiers, and by the sovereign himself, the thought occurred to one of the sovereign's Polish adjutant generals of giving a dinner and a ball for the sovereign on the part of his adjutant generals. This thought was greeted joyfully by everyone. The sovereign gave his consent. The adjutant generals collected money by subscription. The person who might be the most pleased to the sovereign was invited to be hostess of the ball. Count Benigsin, a landowner of Vilna province, offered his country house for the fete, and the 13th of June was the day fixed for the dinner, ball, boat rides, and fireworks at Zakret, Count Benigsin's country home. On the same day on which Napoleon gave orders to cross the Niemen and his vanguard troops, driving back the Cossacks across the Russian border, Alexander spent the evening at Benigsin's house at the ball given by his adjutant generals. It was a gay, brilliant fete. Connoisseurs said that rarely had so many beauties gathered in one place. Countess Bezukov, among other Russian ladies who had followed the sovereign from Petersburg to Vilno, was at this ball, eclipsing the refined Polish ladies by her heavy, so-called Russian beauty. She was noticed, and the sovereign favored her with a dance. Boris Debretskoy and Gasson, playing the bachelor as he put it, having left his wife in Moscow, was also at this ball, and though not an adjutant general, contributed a large sum to the subscription for the ball. Boris was now a rich man, far advanced in honors, no longer seeking patronage, but standing on an equal footing with the highest of his peers. At midnight, the dancing was still going on. Helene, who did not have a worthy partner, invited Boris for the mazurka herself. They sat out as the third couple. Boris, glancing coolly at Helene's gleaming bare shoulders emerging from the gown of her dark gauze with gold, talked of old acquaintances, and at the same time, unnoticeably to himself and others, never ceased for a second to observe the sovereign, who was in the same room. The sovereign was not dancing. He stood in the doorway and stopped now one couple, now another, with gracious words that he alone knew how to utter. At the start of the mazurka, Boris saw the Adjutant General Balashov, one of the closest persons to the sovereign, go up to him and in uncourtly fashion stop very close to the sovereign, who was talking with a Polish lady. When he finished talking with the lady, the sovereign glanced around questioningly and evidently realizing that Balashov was acting that way only because there was a very important reason for it, nodded slightly to the lady and turned to Balashov. As soon as Balashov began to speak, the sovereign's face showed astonishment. He took Balashov by the arm and walked across the room with him, unconsciously clearing a 7-yard path for himself on both sides as people made way for him. Boris noted Arikchev's troubled face as the sovereign walked with Balashov. Arikchev, glancing at the sovereign from under his eyebrows and puffing through his red nose, stepped out from the crowd as if expecting the sovereign to address him. Boris realized that Arikchev envied Balashov and was displeased that some obviously important news had reached the sovereign not through him. But the sovereign and Balashov went out, without noticing Arikchev, through the door leading to the lighted garden. Arikchev, holding his sword and looking around spitefully, followed some 20 paces behind them. While performing the figures of the mazurka, Boris was ceaselessly tormented by the thought of the news brought by Balashov and how to find it out before anyone else. During a figure in which he had to choose a lady, whispering to Helene that he wanted to choose Countess Potocki, who seemed to have gone out to the balcony, he rushed, gliding over the parquet, to the door to the garden, and seeing the sovereign step onto the terrace with Balashov, stopped. The sovereign and Balashov were heading for the door. Boris, flustered as if he had no time to retreat, pressed himself deferentially to the doorframe and lowered his head. The sovereign, with the agitation of a man personally offended, was finishing the following words: "To enter Russia without a declaration of war, I will make peace only when not a single armed enemy remains on my soil," he said. It seemed to Boris that the sovereign enjoyed uttering these words. He was pleased with the form in which he had expressed his thought, but pleased that Boris had overheard it. "No one must know anything," the sovereign added, frowning. Boris understood that this referred to him, and closing his eyes, bowed his head lightly. The sovereign went back into the room and remained at the ball for another half hour. Boris was the first to learn the news of French troops crossing the Niemen, and thanks to that, had the chance to show certain important persons that much of what was concealed from others was known to him, and thereby had the chance to rise higher in the opinion of those persons. The unexpected news of the French crossing the Niemen was particularly unexpected after a month of unfulfilled expectation, and that at a ball. The sovereign, in the first moment of receiving the news, under the influence of indignation and offense, had found a phrase which later became famous, which he liked himself, and which fully expressed his feelings. On returning home from the ball, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the sovereign sent for his secretary, Shishkov, and told him to write an order to the army and a rescript to the field marshal, Prince Saltykov, in which he insistently demanded the insertion of words that he would not make peace so long as a single-armed Frenchman remained on Russian soil. The next day, the following letter was sent to Napoleon. "Monsieur mon frère, Monsieur my brother, I learned yesterday that despite the loyalty in which I have kept my promise to your Majesty, your troops have crossed the borders of Russia, and I have just received a note from Petersburg in which Count Lauriston announces, as the cause of this aggression, that your Majesty has considered himself in a state of war with me from the moments when Prince Kurakin asked for his passports. The motives upon which the Duke of Bassano based his refusal to deliver them to him would never have made me suppose that this step could ever serve as a pretext for aggression. Indeed, this ambassador was never authorized to take it, as he has declared himself, and as soon as I was informed of it, I made known to him how much I disapproved of him by ordering him to remain at his post. If your majesty is not intent on shedding the blood of our peoples for a misunderstanding of this sort, and consents to withdraw his troops from Russian territory, I will regard what has occurred as cancelled, and an agreement between us will be possible. In the contrary case, your majesty, I will find myself forced to repel any attack which nothing on my part has provoked. It still depends on your majesty to spare humanity the calamities of a new war. I remain, etc. Signed, Alexander. And that's the end of section 3, which I think is rather interesting as we get into this war, a bit more of Tolstoy's philosophy around war, which still which feels so very relevant as so many things are in upheaval. This idea that many things contribute to conflict, and it's the duty of each person to, maybe not the duty is not the right word, but each person carries the responsibility. You can't just say that, oh, well, this general led me there. Everyone has their free will to make the choices that either lead to aggression or don't. And I think that's very telling. And also the fact that many things stack up over time. And sometimes you can look at an isolated incident and say, well, this is what started it. But in truth, there are many things that lead up to it. And so to weigh those things, to look at what all the causes and all the tiniest little aggressions or misunderstandings that can lead up to a thing. And then to also have the presence of mind to be able to know that even despite all those things, you still have the choice to either engage in aggression or step aside, or to actively try to prevent it. And I think there's a great deal of wisdom there, especially right now when there's so much upheaval and so much fracturization within, especially American culture. And I think having a little bit more wisdom of history and presence of mind would aid us a lot. Because I think that currently our culture is told to react a lot to things. And that is reaction is easily manipulated. Reaction is easily provoked. So I think there's something to that. Yeah, and there's a good deal there. So, yep, I hope everyone can stay safe. I hope everyone can be reflective before they act. It's definitely difficult. And think about that idea of like actions that can lead to the death of millions. And I think everyone's, as you see the soldiers who are gung-ho to please someone or gung-ho to go to war or to prove their mettle, often that sort of fervor can, without any wisdom attached to it, just leads you to drown in a river for nothing. And I think that's something to think about. And everyone wants to go to war and wants to win, but no one's ready to be the one to die. And you may say you are until the moment you are ready to die. And then, do you really want to die that way? Do you really want to die, especially if you lose? I don't know. There's a lot there. So I hope you all are staying safe, staying smart, loving and considerate of other people, looking out. I still have all the links up for and information for things you can do to support Black Lives Matter. And I want to put together some like businesses and things to check out that are like Black and minority owned. And definitely fill out a petition for Elijah McClain. His story is just so tragic, and it's something that shouldn't have had to happen. Keep wearing masks, washing your hands. I'll see you guys all tomorrow. Have a great day.